Let's create the database tables required for our app. We can see that currently we don't have any tables. We need 2 tables for our app. One to store department details and another one to store employee details. Let's start with department table. This table will have 2 fields. One to store an auto-generated table ID and another one to store the department name. Let's insert some records using insert query. Now let's check the data in our table using select query. Let us similarly create table to store employee details. We will be storing employee ID, employee name, department to which the employee belongs to, the date of joining, and also the uploaded profile picture file name. Let's insert a record. And check data using select query. We have now successfully created the database objects needed for our app. Let's create the .NET Core Web API project. Let's open up Visual Studio first. Click on Create a new project. Choose ASP.NET Web API Core. Choose appropriate folder. We might not need HTTPS for now. Now let's take a look at some of the important files. All the dependencies and packages needed for our app can be found in the Dependencies folder. Launch settings.json file contains the details of how the project should be started. Controllers folders contains controllers in which we write our API methods. We generally keep the configuration details such as database details in app settings.json. The program.cs contains the main program, which is the entry point of our app. Also, it creates webhost, which basically helps the app to listen to HTTP requests. The startup class configures all the services needed for our app. Services are basically reusable components that can be used across our app using dependency injection. It also contains the configure method, which creates our app's request processing pipeline. We need to make a couple of changes in startup class. One is to enable the cores. By default, all Web API projects come with a security which blocks requests coming from different domains. We are basically writing instructions to disable that security and allow the requests to be served. We are also making one more change to the serializer class to keep the JSON serializer as our default. We might need to install a NuGet package to do this. Let's import the namespace. Now let's simply run the project and check if everything works fine. We see that the project works as expected, and we see the JSON result from one of the sample controller method. Now let's create the models needed for our app. Let's create a folder to add our models. Let's add the department model. Department model has two fields: department ID and department name. Next, let's add the employee model. It has 5 fields: employee ID, employee name, department, date of joining, and photo file name. Let's start creating the API methods. Let me first add the SQL Server connection string in app settings JSON file. Now let's add an empty controller to write our API methods for department details screen. To work with SQL Server, we need to install a NuGet package. The package name is system.data.sql client. Let's also import the namespaces. To read the connection strings from app settings file, we need to make use of dependency injection. Now let's write an API method to get all data from department table. I am writing raw queries here. You can choose to write stored procedures or maybe use entity framework for this. I will be getting the data into a data table object. Using the given SQL connection and command, we will execute our query. And fill the data into data table using SQL Data Reader. Finally, we will return this data in JSON format. Let's test this API method. This seems to work. Let's now add the post method to insert new record into department table. We will be sending the department object to our post method in the form body. Let's also create the put method to update records. And finally, let's implement the delete method. Now let's test our API methods. We will be using Postman to test since we can test only get method in the browser. The get method seems to be working. Let's add another department using post method. Looks like we are not sending success message after adding. Let's try again. We see that the record is added successfully. Let's verify this. Now let's use the put method to update a record. The put method also works as expected. Now let's check the delete method. We need to make some changes to the delete method to accept the ID and URL. We see that the delete method also works as expected. Let's implement the API methods for employee details screen. Let's add an empty API controller. Let's copy the contents from department controller and make changes accordingly. Now let's test our APIs. The get method works fine. Let's test the post method to insert a record. Post method works fine as expected. Now let's test the put method and update a record. And finally, let's test the delete method. The delete method also works as expected. Let's now write an API to upload the photos. Let's create a folder to store photos. To be able to use this folder to store and retrieve photos, we need to add some instructions in the startup class. Now let's write the API method. I am giving a custom root name for this method, and this is a post method. If there is any exception while saving file, I will simply return the default anonymous picture file name. We are going to extract the first file, which is attached to form data. We need to again use the dependency injection to get the application path to Photos folder. Once the file is saved, we will simply return the file name. Let's now test the API by uploading an image file. We see that the upload was successful and we can see the image in the newly created path.